In last week's podcast, I mentioned the International Monetary Fund prediction that COVID-19 is likely to cost the global economy at least $8 trillion. That you might think is an estimate, possibly an educated guess, a sort of guesstimate. But when Lord Jim O'Neill, the eminent British economist, best known for coining the phrase BRICS, the acronym that stands for Brazil, Russia, India and China, the four rapidly developing countries symbolizing the shift away from G7, also says that 8 trillion estimate is very real, then I believe him. 8 trillion. That's 12 zeros, and it'll have an impact on all of us, whether we live in comparative comfort in the UK or are the poor huddled masses across Asia and Africa. We will all feel the effects. When Lord O'Neill came onto my show, The Agenda with Stephen Cole, he was pessimistic about how Africa, for example, could recover, even survive the financial implications of the pandemic. He told me that developing countries will find themselves in even worse situations as their access to international capital markets becomes more constrained. Without the money, they won't be able to buy goods and services, including life-saving medical supplies. It's a very grim forecast. In the wake of the 2008 crisis, the UK government just wanted to get things back to normal. Perhaps they succeeded all too well, restoring job creation and bailing out the banks. This time, the new normal needs to be different from the old normal. Right now, the economy is on the operating table, awaiting life-saving surgery, and obviously, saving the patient's life is the priority. The Bank of England is predicting that the global pandemic could cause one of the worst recessions in modern history. More than 6 million people are currently on furlough and having 80% of their wages paid by the government while they're on temporary leave. It's costing the country a fortune, at least £14 billion a month. And who will pay the bill? Yes, it'll be the taxpayers. And in Europe, the situation seems even worse. According to the EU's economy chief, Paolo Gentiloni, the European Union is bracing itself for what he called a recession of historic proportions, an economic shock without precedent since the Great Depression. Yet, despite all these depressing forecasts, I still believe that no one yet knows the true cost of COVID-19. What we do know is it's not going to be cheap. In the UK, the expense of lockdown is already extraordinary. GDP figures show the economy shrank at its fastest pace in more than a decade in the first 3 months of this year. But in some ways, those figures are the inevitable consequence of policies to support jobs and businesses. Governments now are urging people to go back to work as soon as possible, where possible. Another round of austerity is a possibility, but I think that's politically unlikely. So what should governments do now? Well, for a start, they need to realise there are no precedents here to work from. We've never locked down the global economy before, and we won't know the long-term consequences of doing that for some to come. So the big question is, what's the difference between a recession and a depression? Well, answer, well, we're about to find out the hard way, unless, that is, the politicians manage to head off the approaching financial meltdown. Now, a common definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. The last time that happened in the UK was in 2008 and 9, when the economy shrank over 5 consecutive quarters. It was the deepest recession then since the war. The COVID recession will be much, much deeper. In 2008, Britain played an important part on the international stage, catalysing a coherent global response to the financial crisis. With America embroiled in its electoral politics and the EU racked by yet another existential crisis, the UK needs to step up once again. The politicians need to steer the UK and Europe away from the rocks of depression. Now, there have been many analogies made comparing fighting the virus with fighting a war, and many of them are true, except the enemy so real on one hand is invisible on the other. One way could be a national unity government, bringing in the most experienced and capable people from all parties. They would, of course, have to put aside any ideological hang-ups about government intervention, because, make no mistake, governments will have to intervene left, right and centre, doing whatever it takes, not only to beat the pandemic, but to save our economies. At this stage, we still don't know which industries are going to topple over. Obviously, it's looking grim for the airlines. Things can't be good for the rail companies either. And of course, it's a complete disaster for the leisure and retail sectors. Now, ministers need to make extremely rapid, strategically sound decisions about what to save and what not to save. And they must also act for the common good. Corporate big hitters who use share buybacks and other tricks to engineer their way to short-term financial gain should be made to pay a heavy price. Private equity funds that bled their holdings dry should expect to lose everything. Landlords should be treated with as much or as little mercy as they've shown to their tenants. And also, I think companies registered in tax havens can be bailed out by those tax havens, not us. But beware, not every corporate malefactor is on its knees. Look up and you'll see the vulture capitalists circling in the sky, hoping to gorge themselves on distressed assets. This pandemic could easily escalate from a health crisis to a humanitarian crisis, and ultimately to a solvency crisis for many countries. The real fear is political stability, because this crisis will be much deeper and more prolonged than people think. This COVID crisis is a shattering experience. Even if we avoid a depression, we'll be living in its shadow for a generation. Yet it could also be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to change the way we work, earn, and live. But only the historians will be in a position to know those answers.